Right now, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, who will be providing a great overview of fiscal responsibility laws, the fiscal rules, and who is a great and honorable guest for us, Professor Andrés Velasco. He is Professor of Professional Practice and International Development at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs in New York City, and he's also a former presidential candidate and finance minister of Chile. He was also part of the team that negotiated Chile's commercial agreements with Mexico, Canada, and the United States. He has taught development and international finance at Harvard University, was director of the Center for Latin American Studies of New York University, and has published over 100 articles and 4 books on international economics and development. He holds a PhD in economics from Columbia University and a postdoctoral degree in political economy from Harvard University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It is my great honor to introduce Andrés Velasco.
Good morning. Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here. Congratulations to Mike and to Deepak for putting together this event on a topic that could not be more important. Those were very timely, eloquent, and profound words that Mike uttered, and I'm hoping to be able to put some meat on those bones of what it is that we can do to provide a better alternative for Puerto Rico. I am not an expert on the island. I'm not an expert on American politics. I'm an academic and a former policymaker in Latin America. You know, Latin America used to be the place of bad and populistic politics, and watching the American primaries, I feel that I'm right at home. You know, so in that capacity, I will be bold to maybe make some suggestions and put forward some proposals. Let me just begin with the bare facts. Everybody in the room knows them, but it may be worth just to restate them. Puerto Rico has a lot of public debt, 73 billion. And if you compare that with US states, only California and New York have more public debt. And of course, the island's economy is not the size of California's, it's not the size of New York, it's about the size of Kansas. As a result, if you look at the ratios we economists like to compute, you know, debt to GDP and all of that, it is very much over-indebted. And if you compare it to municipalities, when Detroit went belly up, it had 19 billion in debt. Puerto Rico has a lot more than that. So we have a problem. Now, that's kind of obvious, but let's dig a little bit deeper. This is clearly a financial problem, a financial failure, but I think more deeply than that, what this reveals is an institutional failure, because Puerto Rico, like most countries, for a long time has had in place lots of rules and lots of regulations to prevent overspending, excessive deficits, excessive debt accumulation, et cetera, et cetera. Problem is, many of these rules were on the books, in print, but seldom obeyed. And of course, this is not new. This happens all over the world, not only in Latin America. The European Union has lots of fiscal policy rules, and you know, in countries as large and rich and venerable as Spain or France or Italy, they're routinely flaunted. So, you know, Puerto Rico's in pretty good company. Now, if you begin to think of the problem in these terms, I think a special kind of solution begins to suggest itself. Because clearly, if what we have is an institutional problem, we have to come up with a solution that involves institution building. We will clearly have to think in terms of comprehensive solutions. I would put it to you that part of that comprehensive solution will be debt reduction, and I'm sure that's a controversial issue, but you know, the sooner we recognize this, the better. Had Greece and the IMF and the European Union recognized 5 years ago that Greece needed debt reduction, the problem in Europe would have been much less. Delaying that recognition was really a policy failure and a political failure. I hope the same does not happen in Puerto Rico. But beyond that, we have to think of how it is that the solutions that we come up with today will help Puerto Rico have a set of fiscal institutions and political institutions and budget rules and procedures that will endure and which will give rise to a good and sound fiscal policy, not just in the next 18 months or 2 years or 5 years, but in the next 2, 5, 10 decades. As a result, I think institution building is really where the debate ought to be. And that is where fiscal rules come in. I've spent a lot of time, both as an academic and as a policymaker, thinking about fiscal rules. So I want to persuade you today that maybe this idea of a fiscal rule has a contribution to make in the debate in Puerto Rico. So let me step back a little bit. I told you already Puerto Rico is not alone. Fiscal problems are endemic in countries that are rich and poor alike, in Europe and Asia and Latin America, et cetera, et cetera. Now let me just get more precise. If you look at the literature, and there's a vast academic literature on the subject, economists typically identify two problems, and Puerto Rico, needless to say, suffers from both. What I'm going to call a deficit bias problem and a pro-cyclicality problem. And those are big, ugly words, but you know, this is kind of a wonkish subject anyway, so please forgive me. What's the deficit bias? The deficit bias is a violation of what basic economics teaches you you should do with fiscal policy. You know, if you read kind of the basic ideas dating back to Adam Smith and to Keynes, economists would say, when times are good, your coffers are full, save, run surpluses. When times are bad, your coffers are empty, dissave, run deficits. Of course, on average, you should neither run a surplus nor run a deficit so that you don't accumulate or decumulate debt. In practice, a lot of countries run deficits in bad times, which is okay, but they also run deficits in good times. And Puerto Rico is an example of that. Across the economic cycle, it has been running deficits. And of course, a big debt is nothing but the accounting counterpart of a lot of deficits. And when that problem happens year after year after year, you have a problem of deficit bias and excess debt. And that's exactly the problem that you see in Europe, the problem that for many decades we had in many countries in Latin America, and the problem you see in Puerto Rico today. Second issue, pro-cyclicality. Again, fiscal policy, if it worked well, should be moving against the cycle. When times are bad, you want the government to spend more. When times are good, you want the government to step back. However, a lot of countries tend to run fiscal policy exactly the opposite way, exacerbating instead of alleviating the business cycle. And this often happens because, you know, governments march to the tune of financial markets. When, you know, you're in the midst of a boom, you look pretty creditworthy. Everybody wants to lend to you. So the bankers come knocking on your door and the bond issuers come knocking on your door. So you borrow and you spend. When times are bad, nobody wants to lend to you, and as a result, you're forced to curtail expenditure. And we economists call this pro-cyclicality. Let me give you an example of that. This is my favorite picture in this literature is Mexico. Not the current Mexico, but the Mexico of the 60s and the 70s. The green line is the price of oil. Economics 101 would have said when the price of oil is high, Mexico should be running a surplus. But what that picture suggests is exactly the opposite. Whenever the price of oil is high, in the bad old times, Mexico used to run a bigger deficit. Why? Because when the price of oil is high, Mexico looked financially strong, everybody wanted to lend to them, and they borrowed. And as a result, you had a fiscal policy that moved exactly in the opposite way than what both economic theory and common sense would suggest. And that's a bad way to run things. I don't have a picture for you, but I did look at the numbers. Puerto Rico not only has a deficit bias problem, it also has a pro-cyclicality problem. When times are good, it overspends. When times are bad, it is in no position to cushion the cycle. And that's bad for economic reasons. It's also bad for social reasons, because you would want a larger, more active state precisely in bad times to compensate for the falling incomes of households. And if the government cannot do that, that's bad for economics. It's also bad for human welfare. Now, if that is a problem, or those are the two problems, what can you do? One increasingly common formula is to say, let us not guide fiscal policy by means of discretion, so that the government or the legislature every year kind of make it up and say, oh, this year we have a deficit, this year we have a surplus, or actually, this year we have a deficit, and this next year we also have a deficit, which is a more common practice. Rather, begin to think about fiscal policy, as a longer-term exercise in which you plan and in which you constrain your future behavior by means of a rule. Okay? And if you design the rule properly, it helps you get around both of the problems. Kind of obviously, if you respect the rule, you will not have too many deficits, you will not borrow too much. But in addition to that, if you design the rule right, and I'll tell you a little bit more in a minute about what this means, you can have a rule that is both strict on average, so that on average you're reducing your debt, but which leaves you enough elbow room to spend a little bit more in bad times. Of course, you have to make it up by spending a little bit less in good times. And this is what I'm going to call a smart fiscal rule. This is kind of the fashion of the day, and institutions like the OECD, the European Union, and the IMF have gone around the world in the past decade suggesting that countries have fiscal rules. And as of, that's the IMF definition. I will not read it to you because it's kind of boring and wordy. The basic idea is rules as opposed to discretion, and long-term horizon as opposed to short-term horizon. If you take that away, that's basically what we need to know. And by 2009, 80 countries in the world had some kind of a fiscal rule. Of course, some are good fiscal rules, very smart, some are not, some are obeyed, some are not. But I think there are plenty of countries in which the experience is very good. If you look at Europe, Sweden is a very good example. Sweden used to be a country with a humongous public debt a decade and a half ago. Sweden today has one of the lowest public debts in the world, not just in Europe. Secondly, in the aftermath of a big fiscal problem in the European Union, in the Eurozone, the European treaties today compel every country in the Eurozone to adopt a fiscal rule. So every country is in the process of doing so. For my taste, the country that did it best is Ireland. Ireland has a really smart fiscal rule. And if you look at other countries in the world, New Zealand and Australia have fiscal rules that work pretty well. And in my part of the world, Chile, Colombia, and Peru have fiscal rules that have been around for a while. Chile has been around for 15 years. And in my view, they've also worked pretty well. One question might be, from a skeptical audience, we're in Washington, we all like politics, and if you like politics, you're likely to be a skeptic. One question would be, well, if there were all these rules in the past in Puerto Rico and nobody followed them, why should they follow this rule? And I think that's a good question, but there's a good answer to that question, and the question is this. Fiscal rules that are not smart, fiscal rules that constrain you too much and prevent you from carrying out counter-cyclical policies are an invitation to being evaded, right? That's why, parenthetically, why balanced budget amendments are not a good idea. And countries which have them, or US states that have them, typically find their ways, you have creative accountants and smart lawyers, you typically find your way out, right? Because precisely, rule can be too lax if it doesn't constrain you at all. But if the rule is too tight and leaves you no room, for instance, to spend more if you have a natural disaster, or if it leaves you no room to run a deficit if for some reason your revenues fall, then politically that rule is going to be untenable. Down the road, somebody is going to escape it through some creative way. So the fact that a rule is smart, the fact that a rule constrains behavior over the long run, but it gives you some elbow room in the short run, makes the rule politically more sustainable. It makes it a smarter way to lower debt and to constrain fiscal misbehavior. And there are many cases, I'll show you a couple in a minute, in which in fact these rules have been put into place, they have lasted, they have been obeyed, and debt has come down quite a bit. Now, one question would be, and you probably can't read the slide, but it's just a reminder to myself what I have to say. Somebody would say, well, the political reality is that if there is debt reduction in Puerto Rico, then some kind of an oversight board will exist. You tell me, I'm not an expert, but I am told by people who know a lot more than I do that that is a likely possibility. So the question is then, what should the oversight board do? I've sort of glanced at the debate, and I have the sense that there are a lot of people who are saying oversight board with a great deal of enthusiasm, and then you ask, so what does it do? And the typical answer is, well, I don't really know. I have to think about it, okay? I do know, so let me give you a suggestion. I think the oversight board is a perfect complement for a proper implementation of a fiscal rule in a very precise sense. First, if you have a fiscal rule, you have to have a target. On average, across the business cycle, will you have a balanced budget? On average, will you have a surplus of 1% of GDP, a surplus of 2% of GDP, etc.? In an ideal world in which institutions are working well and in which know-how of the technical kind is plentiful, you would want elected officials on the island to set this rule, as it happens in Latin America, as it happens in Europe. In current circumstances, because of political realities and also because of limited know-how about implementation of such a rule, you can imagine that at least for the first few years, the oversight board would be setting this target. And that's a very important choice, of course. Secondly, you have to monitor compliance. And it is quite possible, because economic variables are random, that you may miss the target slightly. Not because you were cheating, not because you were misbehaving, simply because your revenues last year were a little bit lower than projected. Second role of the oversight board, they come in and they say, oh, you missed it by 0.1% of GDP last year. Well, you make it up in this way, over 1 year, over 2 years. Again, that's politically a difficult but important role. Thirdly, there are a million technical details that surround the implementation of a rule. And because the rule is meant to constrain the government, you don't want the government to be in full control of the technical details, because that gives you precisely the elbow room to wiggle out by redefining a variable or misestimating something. So the oversight board could be in charge of all the technical details for implementation. Last but not least, applying a rule of this sort needs forecast of the future. For instance, you need to take a stance. What is the expected reasonable rate of growth for the island economy for the next 10 years? Again, you wouldn't want the government to make that forecast because it's likely to be a biased forecast. So the Fiscal Oversight Board could appoint a team of independent, respected academics who would give you that number and who would give you a bunch of other numbers so that you had unbiased, credible forecast that, in fact, the inputs that go into the application of the rule. So I think that politically speaking, one can imagine a situation in which you have an oversight board, but you give it the right job. I think for political reasons, for ownership reasons, and also for economic efficiency reasons, it would be a terrible idea to have a bureaucrat in Washington deciding whether in San Juan you build a park here or a park there, or whether you spend more on parks or whether you spend more on parking lots or paving streets. Those are decisions that are best taken at the local level. First, because people know what they like and want and need, and secondly, because an intervention from the outside at that level of detail, I think, is likely to be politically very harmful. So the right job for the board is to operate at the macro level, to set these targets, to make sure that the rule is implemented. Now, just before I end, let me just give you one example of a rule that has worked pretty well. And of course, full disclosure, I was one of the people who put together the fiscal rule in Chile. So you may take this as a bit of self-promotion, but it's been around for 15 years. I was only a minister for 4 of the 15. So by now, different governments of the right and the left, under 4 different presidents, and 5 different finance ministers have been applying the rule. So this is a more institutional national achievement, not simply what one guy did. So in Chile, we take a lot of care in precisely making sure that the rule leaves a little elbow room to allow the government to offset the cyclical behavior of the economy. So what you do is you estimate a bunch of things that are important, like the trend rate of growth of the economy, like the price of copper. Copper is very important because Chile is the largest producer of copper in the world. And you put that into a set of equations, I will not bore you with the equations, which allow you to estimate what is the long-run feasible revenue of the government. Not the revenue today, which may be high, you're in a boom, low, you're in a recession, but the average sustainable revenue. And then it says you're allowed to spend your sustainable revenue no more. Maybe if you have a lot of debt and you want to reduce the debt, in fact, you don't spend all of your sustainable revenue, you set aside a bit for debt reduction. In Chile, we have a surplus target of 1% of GDP, so over the cycle, debt goes down to the tune of 1% per year, and that sets a ceiling for expenditures. What has happened with this rule? First of all, if you worry about pro-cyclicality, in Chile we have pretty much been able to get around this. The line that wiggles around is the price of copper. and the bars are the fiscal surpluses. So what you see there is when the price of copper is low, Chile has been running deficits. When the price of copper is high, Chile ran surpluses. I was a finance minister in, oh no, those are years, by the way, 2004, 5, 6, 7. I was a finance minister when Chile ran the very big surpluses to the tune of 8 points of GDP, okay? When I took the job, I had no gray hair. When I came out, I looked like this. That's the price you pay for very large surpluses. Now, the benefit of very large surpluses is this. Back in 1990, Chile had net debt of 40 points of GDP and gross debt of about 70 points of GDP. So we had a lot of debt. By the time 2006 rolled around, Chile was a net debtor. That is to say, sorry, a net creditor. That is to say, we had more assets and liabilities. So over 15 or 20 years, the fiscal rule accomplished a lot of debt reduction. And I think that's a really key point, because in Puerto Rico, even after some restructuring exercise, the island will have a lot of debt. So you need a rule that credibly promises to people you can bring down debt. And that's an example of a country not too different from Puerto Rico that accomplished that in a pretty dramatic way. Last but not least, we had a stabilization fund. So we saved some cash to be used in the case of an emergency. And when Lehman Brothers went under, we were sitting on something like $60 billion, which for Chile is a lot. We were able to do very aggressive counter-cyclical anti-crisis measures. And I'll skip that. That's the countries of the world and the policies they applied in 2009. On the vertical axis is the size of a fiscal stimulus. On the horizontal axis is the size of the interest rate cut. So the farther you are to the northeast, the bigger your combination of fiscal and monetary stimulus. Chile is the red square there. By this standard, Chile undertook the largest anti-crisis set of measures in the world. Why did we do it? Not because we were so bold or so creative. We did it simply because we could afford to. You know, we had a lot of money in the bank, right? So in Chile, the recession following the Lehman Brothers meltdown lasted for 6 months. In a country like Spain, which did the opposite, the recession lasted 6 years. Okay, and that's a very big difference. So let me simply end. Oh, and of course, after the crisis, those are rates of growth of the Chilean economy quarter by quarter. You know, we had a contraction around 2008 and 9, but the economy took off pretty strongly right after that, precisely because the fiscal fundamentals were okay. So let me just end by reiterating that I think this is a financial problem, but also an institutional problem. If we want a long-lasting solution, not simply a short-term solution, we have to think about what fiscal institutions we build in Puerto Rico that will be credible and lasting. And I think a fiscal institution that is based on the application of a smart rule is both better from an economic point of view. It helps you lower debt. It helps you weather crises. But in addition to that, for political reasons, it would have ownership and it would have the necessary flexibility to make it politically palatable, politically sustainable, and therefore credible for financial markets, credible for Washington, and most important, credible for the people who live on the island. Thanks very much.